pleasure to introduce to you Anders Engberg-Pedersen, who has been kind enough to come here from Denmark, simply to join us in this conversation. I am immensely pleased to have a chance to meet him, and I'm sure you've all had fine opportunities to talk with him, and we'll have more time to talk with him as the afternoon goes on. I think this is your first time here. Is that
Yes.
right? Yes. So let me introduce Anders a bit. He's currently Associate Professor of Comparative Literature at the University of Southern Denmark, where he works in the Department for the Study of Culture. I first came to know Anders' work on the recommendation of our Boundary 2 colleague and Harvard University press editor, Lindsay Waters, who mentioned to me the Harvard publication of Anders' book this year called Empire of Chance, which is subtitled The Napoleonic Wars and the Disorder of Things. And in turn, I had the opportunity to read Anders' paper entitled Governed by Chance on War, Disorder, and Representation, on the recommendation of another Boundary 2 colleague in California, Arne de Bover, who's not here this weekend. And we were also taken with our admiration for that paper that we posted it on the Boundary 2 website, which is where you will find it now, boundary2.org. I recommend that you take a look at it. I thought the best way to give you a very quick sense of Anders' book, as well as point to the obvious reasons why he should be part of our conversation here this weekend, is just to lift a little bit from the blurb written by editors at Harvard Press to describe the book, and I'll just steal a few lines. Napoleon's campaigns were the most complex military undertakings in history before the 19th century. But the defining battles of Austerlitz, Borodino, and Waterloo changed more than the nature of warfare. Concepts of chance, contingency, and probability became permanent fixtures in the West's understanding of how the world works. Empire of Chance examines anew the place of war in the history of Western thought, showing how the Napoleonic Wars inspired a new discourse on knowledge. As Anders Engberg-Pedersen makes clear, after Napoleon, the state of war no longer appeared exceptional, but normative. It became a prism that revealed the underlying operative logic determining the way society is ordered and unfolds. This description alone gives you reason to understand how Anders is already in conversation with Julian and David and others who have been speaking here for the last 2 days. Anders is currently writing 3 more books. One on...
Not books, projects.
Projects.
Scare us all.
Yeah, that's scary me. He's currently working on 3. I like people who are working on books, because that's what I do. That way you can never actually finish the project. He's working on 3 texts. On tact, which surprised me a bit, on literature and cartography, which is of course now an important field in literary studies, and I quote, a book on military aesthetics, from which I think today we will hear a part. Recently I know that Anders gave a paper in Amsterdam under the title War and Chance. He created the blog War, which, among other things, maps chance in Napoleon's battles and pays considerable attention to geodata. So please join me in welcoming Anders to Boundary 2 meeting. His title today, as you see, is Military Aesthetics, Technology Experience, and Late Modern War.
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I've learned a lot in the past 2 days. As I told Paul,
and still awake. Hopefully I will be awake also. The jet lag is beginning to kick in, but let's see, I should manage. As Paul mentioned, questions of warfare and knowledge have been occupying me for a while. In this recent book, which is also my first book, I attempted to look at the state of war, not from a legal or a political perspective immediately, but as a problem of epistemology. What happens to knowledge in the state of war? And against the background of large-scale warfare around 1800, I noticed how war functioned as a kind of prism that reorganized basic categories of time, space, and knowledge across a whole spectrum of fields. Military theory proper, but also parts of philosophy, literature, pedagogy, and attempts at map-making. As the title of that book indicates, I tried to show how a number of new epistemic models arose, models that were based on contingency, on chance, and on action, and the ways in which these epistemic models were intimately tied with poetics and aesthetics. So how might you detect a shift in the thinking of war by looking at the imbrication of poetics and epistemology? That was my basic question. So the attempt was, you might say, to develop a poetics of military knowledge. Now, what might such an approach tell us about more contemporary matters? How do questions of poetics and aesthetics inform current wars? So this is sort of the new area I'm beginning to move into, and what I would like to sort of try to begin to explore today. And I will approach these questions through the work of an artist, namely Harun Farooqi, the German documentarist and installation artist who for years, until he passed away rather unexpectedly a little over a year ago, had traced the technological development of the images of war. About 5 years ago, however, he turned his attention to the simulations of war that are currently performed in immersive virtual reality war games. With his 4-part-site video installation, which received quite a bit of attention, Serious Games from 2010, he provides a perspective not just on immersive war games such as virtual Iraq and virtual Afghanistan, but also on the rise of the whole military entertainment complex, or MINEnet, the Military Industrial Media Entertainment Network, as James Dedarian has labeled it. No longer at the forefront of technological development, the military has collaborated with Hollywood and the video game industry, as well as with academic institutions such as the Institute for Creative Technologies, the ICT, at the University of Southern California, in order to try to catch up with the possibilities of digital technology. So in 1999, the Department of Defense awarded the university a $45 million 5-year contract to sponsor a university-affiliated research center working in a collaboration with US Army research laboratories. At the opening ceremony, the president of the USC appeared next to the secretary of the US Army, along with the CEO of Silicon Graphics, the president of the Motion Picture Association of America, the deputy mayor of Los Angeles, as well as the governor of California, the then governor of California, Gray Davis, who was virtually present on a screen via satellite from Sacramento. Now, the purpose of this joint venture between the military, Hollywood, the game industry, the political and educational institutions was, in their own words, to bring film and game industry artists together with computer and social scientists to study and develop immersive media for military training, health therapies, education, and more. The ICT has since received 3 new contracts, the most recent one worth $135 million. And over the course of the past 15 years, the Institute has produced a number of immersive media and synthetic environments that have gradually been adopted by US military institutions. Using such carefully crafted virtual world to interpolate its users, the military has co-opted a field that one does not usually associate with a war, namely the field of aesthetics. The collaboration with filmmakers, designers, software programmers, and game developers have meant that a host of concepts that traditionally belong to the theory of art have gained a new urgency as they have migrated into the military realm. Today, questions of fictionality, affective response, experience, suspension of disbelief, all part of the standard vocabulary of aesthetics, increasingly shape how war is waged. At the same time, the military has retooled these concepts and thereby forged a whole new set of aesthetic categories. Curiously and somewhat disconcertingly, the military has become part of an aesthetic avant-garde, an institution where some of the most radical changes in aesthetics are taking place. Co-opting aesthetics for its own purposes, the military has established an aesthetic regime around fictional worlds that influence, I think, to a large extent, how wars are planned, executed, and also processed. But it is really not at all clear what the nature of these fictions is. How do they organize perception and memory? How do they marshal them for potential action? How do they experiment with the senses? What kind of alternative management do they seek to effect? In what way do such games provide experience by proxy? And what is the character of this experience? Now, these are exactly the questions that Harun Farouki raises in his video installation, Serious Games. So following in the heels of Farouki, I would today like to look more closely at this military aesthetic regime. How does it operate, and with what consequences? And I wanted to show a brief clip from the first of these 4 sequences, Serious Games 1, which I have here.
Fire. We have misfire.
Same section. Or, same squad, 2 rounds to the left. Alright.
Awesome, take 'em. Left side, the left, he's in the front.
And we're gonna push out and envelop instead of base fire. They're all eliminated.
Anders.
Okay. Push up. Push up on mine.
Side.
Fire 60, Patrick. Just took contact from this one to 5878 8092. We're at 90. They saw it. Shotgun on the sunroof. Hey, stay up here and leave your overwatch up here. First squad. Second squad's gonna go down to the road. We're gonna push a little farther up. Copy that, Charlie? Yeah. This one's down. On your left side. Alright, just stay behind me.
Watson just got killed.
Watson's down?
Yes, Watson's down.
Stop, you don't move down.
My friend's protecting his body.
Alright.
Okay, so sitting in front of their computers, there's this group of young soldiers from the US Marine Corps who are training with what is called the Virtual Battle Space 2 in the Battle Simulation Center in 29 Palms, California. And on Farouki's double projection, we see on the left their vehicle driving along the road in a virtual but real terrain generated from actual cartographic material of potential combat zones. And on the right, we see them looking at their screens. So this is the first of the 4 videos. It's entitled Serious Games 1, Watson is Down. Now the war game is intended to familiarize the recruit with the events of war and to train skills of coordination and teamwork. But it also plays an active role in a carefully calibrated affective management. One of the designers of this particular war game is Dr. Albert Rizzo, a research professor at the Institute for Creative Technologies in the ICT. In a project called Stress Resilience in Virtual Environments, or simply STRIVE, he makes use of virtual reality-based immersion to train the optimal psychological response to combat. The premise is that such pre-exposure to stressful events protects soldiers from the subsequent trauma, and that systematic training will strengthen the soldiers' resilience. That is, how quickly and efficiently they return to normal after the stress of combat. In other words, immersive VR technology is now employed both before combat and afterward in an attempt to manage and control human responses to extreme experiences. It is this extension and integration of the domain of the virtual, its preempting of experience, as well as its repetition of experience in the post-combat treatment of trauma that Farouk examines in his installation. As he reveals, the affective management that takes place in the military proceeds along the lines of pre-combat dulling of the senses followed by post-combat resensitization. So as you saw in this clip just before, the platoon comes under fire as the recruits sit in front of their computers, but their reaction is strangely subdued. In the background, other gamers are laughing. They seem fairly disengaged and emotionally detached from the virtual events unfolding in front of them. Several of the soldiers appear bored, stare coolly at the screen. When suddenly Watson's avatar is shot and killed and falls from the vehicle, Watson himself, the avatar's real-world counterpart, simply sighs and pushes himself away from the computer. As a third video in the series Games 3 shows, VR war games replicate the sensory experience of war, its sights and its sounds, and other simulations add further senses such as smell and proprioception in order to build up a level of tolerance. To achieve this effect, the war games are carefully designed and often borrow from the creative work of the billion-dollar video industry, such as the Xbox combat game Full Spectrum Warrior. As Rizzo's team puts it, Strive has developed 6 VR scenarios with advanced gaming development software, cinematically designed lighting, and sound and narrative that maximizes character development and emotional engagement as well as clinical appropriateness. So the aesthetics of the military war game is a curious one. On the one hand, it functionalizes the aesthetic design of the game to manage aesthetics in the old sense of Alexander Baumgarten, that is the sense perception of the recruits. On the other hand, it precisely amalgamates aesthetic design and sensory perception into an anesthetics. The pre-combat war game is designed to build up a sensory tolerance to extreme experience, to induce a preemptive anesthesia, making the soldiers comfortably numb, so to speak. Now, in many respects, this is nothing new. The period between 1770 and 1830 witnessed the invention of the modern war game, or in Prussian parlance, das Kriegsspiel. A number of increasingly intricate war games by names such as Hellwig, Venturini, Allgeier, Chamblon, Opitz, Reiswitz, others, were designed to produce artificially the nature and dynamics of large-scale war in a simulated world. As the title of one such war game from 1806 indicates, the Opitz war game, or a contribution to the Bildung of future tacticians and to the entertainment of even the most experienced tacticians. They focused on the tactical management of war and eventually also sought to teach officers how to grapple with its peculiar epistemic regime. Thus, a major innovation in the history of war games was the introduction by Opitz of the dice that brought uncertainty into the game and called for decisions based on probability. He made a review, there's a review included in sort of the booklet for the game, which I think he wrote himself. It's a wildly positive review, but it does sort of state some of the major components in this, namely that the tremendous shift from sort of an way of operating where people simply take turns to suddenly having to deal with the yes and no of the dice. Will the dice actually tell you whether you can do this or not? And this is, even though it's invented probably the review, it does point in the right direction. 200 years ago, however, the affective and sensory management of the experience of war was seen to require a different medium, not the war game. So in Vom Kriege, published by his wife in 1832 posthumously, Karl von Clausewitz states that only living representations can convey the experience of combat. And he believed that the medium that could generate such representations were texts. So against a more rational training of war games, Clausewitz advocates the reading of history and literature. When speaking of the dangers of war, he provides an elaborate example of how the war experience might appear from the situated point of view of a recruit. This attempt to render the sensory bombardment as realistically as possible is paradigmatic of the subsequent development of literary history. So the 19th century realist war novel, from Balzac to Tolstoy via Stendhal, Crane, partly Hugo, seeks to develop a poetics that generates an immersive, simulated experience of war. Thus, Clausewitz's Russian translator, a man by Mikhail Ivanovich Dragomirov, claimed that the fictional narratives in War and Peace would be, quote, one of the most useful additions to any theoretical course on the art of war. Now, I think current VR has changed that. As Fabocchi states in an interview, perhaps 50 years ago, there would have been a novel by a smart American. He'd have written a novel about this experience in Iraq, as with the Philip Roth generation, the post-World War II generation of writers. But today, VR war games seem to have superseded both text and the traditional 2D war games as the preferred military technology of experience. Indeed, VR might be seen as the merger of the two previous technologies, one that trained tactics and contingency management, the 2D war games, and another that trained the senses and affect management by way of desensitizing through repeated virtual exposure, literary and historical texts. Now, with slight exaggeration, military historian Matti van Cleefeld once stated that around 1800, war was waged on the map. Today, we might say war is increasingly conducted in virtual reality simulations. Now, obviously, the point is not that VR has replaced the real in a procession of simulacra, as Baudrillard somewhat provocatively suggested, but rather that reality no longer stands in opposition to such simulations, but for better or worse, has come to include them. When our representations of war become the means by which war is waged, we need, I think, to expand our notion of the real, not to shrink it. And as Fabocchi's series Games makes evident, embodied simulations form an integral part of what we must now think of as the military real. And it points to the fact that this expanded notion of military reality is organized aesthetically. If VR war games can be seen as the merger of two historical technologies of experience, then this is not too surprising, for in both the history of war games and in the history of the war novel, war has been a matter of design, of character development, of atmosphere and plots, of images, sensations, and emotions. Fabocchi's installation spotlights the degree to which the merger of these two technologies has brought aesthetics into the very center of contemporary warfare. And it shows the ways in which the military has co-opted and functionalized aesthetics in order to optimize the war effort. Now, the workings of this aesthetic management within the military is further examined in his third video installation. And if Serious Games 1 shows the desensitization of the recruits as a preparation for war, Serious Games 3, Immersion, on the other hand, shows how the very same technology is used to resensitize the traumatized soldiers returning from battle. So here's a clip from Serious Games 3.
I'll get to right now, but it was a little, kind of secluded. It kind of turned into a little, courtyard area because there were some posters in there. And just seriously, it was like go around the corner, I hear like this explosion, and I'm like, shit, that's not what I think it is. And so, I turn around really quick, and I go and look to say, I can't see where Jones is at. He's not there, and I'm like, what the hell? So I totally sprint over there. I sprinted over to where he was at, and I'm trying to find out, what happened. And there's smoke, and it's just like it's totally. So I get over to where he's at, and it's like from like his knees up, and that's like all that's there, and there's flesh and there's blood and there's and bits of uniform, and it's it was him, and I'm like, shit. So at that point I'm just like freaking out, I'm like thinking I'm gonna die, that this is not a good idea. Why the hell are we out here doing this? And then I start hearing some gunfire down the street, and so I'm like, hell, what am I gonna do? So I find some place and I just duck and I get behind it. I just kind of curl up into a ball and I'm covering my head and everything, and I'm just seriously like, I'm freaking out, and so there's more gunfire and it's coming closer, and I'm like, this is it. This is seriously it. I've only been here for 3 weeks, and I'm seriously gonna be like paced like Jones. And I couldn't even look at him because I was seriously, I was getting sick. I've never seen
So it actually turns out that this guy you just saw is acting. He has not been to Iraq at all. He's a psychologist, and they're trying to display this system of treating people, and then to show it to the military to see whether they want to buy it. So there's some kind of slight deception involved. So what we see there is it's called virtual reality exposure theory, or simply VRET, which is a treatment in which soldiers repeat their traumatic experience. The woman sitting on the left that you saw can adjust cinematic lighting, computer graphics, and sound effects. So you might say the technologically equipped military psychologist can subsequently replicate the sensory experience of war, its sights and sounds, its smells and vibrations, in order to resensitize the returning soldiers during virtual reality exposure therapy, using the optimal simulation designed for their individual needs. As Ritso, I mentioned before, one of the driving forces in this, puts it, now rather than relying exclusively on imagining a particular scenario, a patient can experience it again in a virtual world under very safe and controlled conditions. So indicating the degree of agitation while reliving the traumatic experiences, the soldier/patient is resensitized in order to process the trauma. The multiple repetition of the trauma is then intended to gradually desensitize the soldier again and return the senses to a stable condition. So it's a sort of technologically updated version of the talking cure. What does this aesthetic management entail for the concept of military experience in the age of its virtual reproducibility? In recent years, philosopher Peter Sloterdijk has examined how training, or üben, as he puts it, has become a dominant cultural form in Western societies. And under the term anthropotechnik, he has gathered various practices and technologies that are used to train and reconfigure human beings. Immersive VR war games may be seen as a specific branch of such human technology, in that they seek to reconfigure and train soldiers by creating actual experience with virtual means. Yet it's worth paying attention to the several subtle but significant differences between the experience generated by these simulations and conventional ways of understanding experience. I think on the one hand, we often think of novelty as a central element. Alex Honneth, for example, writes about experience. We have an experience when the situation is so unfamiliar, so novel, that we cannot orient ourselves and are surprised by the confusion of our intentions, our knowledge, and our sentiments. In such a situation, the meaning of what we encounter is still open. We do not yet possess intellectual means of interpretation that are necessary to master its irritating complexity. In this sense, experiences are constellations, in which affects and intentions, desires, and cognitions constitute a unity that has not yet been disentangled. If we instead turn to a classical statement on experience, the entry in Diderot and D'Alembert's Encyclopédie, novelty is subordinated to the passing of time and reflection. So in their definition, experience is the knowledge that has been obtained through a long life, combined with the reflections on what you have seen and on the fortunate and unfortunate events that have befallen you. In several ways, the training that takes place in VR war games affects a profound transformation of these more traditional notions of experience. So first, the VR simulation is not based on the past, but on future expectations. It borrows from a series of imagined futures, things not experienced, things not seen, and reflections not had. And these imagined futures are then realized by the simulation to generate actual behavioral patterns that can be evoked in non-virtual future settings. The link between the present of the simulation and the future of the subsequent operation is a circular one. It's a temporal collapse in which the future merges with the present as both take place concurrently while the soldiers play the game. Second, the VR simulation is based on compression. It performs a condensation of a variable set of possible experiences. So instead of exposing the soldier to the long periods of eventless boredom, the controlled environment of the simulation designs just the experiences needed. When the instructor in Series Games 1, Watson is Down, places explosive devices and enemy combatants with a few clicks, he creates more events than many recruits experience in weeks or months once deployed. An experiential technology that condenses and optimizes VR offers experience on steroids, so to speak. Third, the VR simulation is based on repetition. Not only are future missions replayed over and over, ideally the experience of actual events will be a repetition of the simulation. That is, it will be a repetition of something that has never happened, of an imagined future that has nevertheless already been played through multiple times. So ideally, experience will therefore not include any unexpected events. In the VR wargames, novelty will have been preempted. As Favoki puts it in an interview, somehow these images are very close to an ideal type. I think they're asking reality to be as calculable as these systems are. Of course, there can be some contingencies and so on, but you know already the ambush must be behind the bridge. So in Clausewitz's military theory, the epistemic regime of war is governed by contingency and probabilistic events. Indeed, he claims that 3/4 of those things on which action in war is based lie in the fog of a greater or lesser uncertainty, end quote. The belief that technology and information networks would provide the army almost perfect situational awareness turned out to be one of the major errors in Afghanistan. But the VR simulation seems to suggest that most contingencies have been accounted for. As one simulation designer puts it, I don't know this, previously soldiers would rely on aerial photography, schematics, or word of mouth before heading into danger. Now they'll be able to literally play through a mission over and over again with their squad mates until they feel they have everything down. When one of the traumatized soldiers undergoing virtual reality exposure therapy replays his actual mission in Serious Games 3, his exclamation, "It was so surreal," refers not to the technological setup in which he is immersed, but to the actual non-calculable events that did not form a part of the reality created by the simulations. Post-combat trauma treatment then tries to do away with the contingent experiences that could nevertheless not be entirely eliminated in training by, once again, repeating them. So surrounded by virtuality, actual experience is not eliminated, but reduced to the briefest of moments. Indeed, if you watch all 4 of these videos in sequence, we, the viewers, go through the same development as the soldiers. We are first prepared, and then we are repaired by immersive technologies, but we never experience the war. So there's not a single image from outside the simulations and the training compounds. From the virtual training and recognition of battle in Serious Games 1, we've flown in an animated sequence designed by Horizon International into a model city or MOUT facility in the desert in Serious Games 2, only to re-enter virtuality in the trauma therapy sessions in Serious Games 3. So in Favoki's installation, the actual event, what we traditionally think of as constituting experience, has been edited out. And finally, as a summation of all the other installations, Serious Games 4 juxtaposes the preparation for war and the reparation after it, while the event experience itself disappears in the seamless transition from the one to the other, exactly 2 minutes and 55 seconds into the video. As Favoki puts it elsewhere, when the players and soldiers of today die in 50 or 60 years, they will not remember an old sleigh from their childhood like Citizen Kane. Rather, they will remember a veiled woman who walked past them in a simulated city. Now, this rather eerie statement cuts, I think, to the heart of the regulatory ideal that lies behind the contemporary invention and management of the war experience. Neither a property of knowledge obtained through combat, nor the exposure to novelty and the unknown. It is the product of a carefully calibrated experimental setup. Within the military aesthetic regime, war experience is designed. Now, if VR war games seek to achieve their effects by way of immersion, Favoki's installation, however, proceeds in the opposite direction. The double projection, which you've seen a couple of times, offers the viewer 2 simultaneous perspectives. One of the screens presents the immersed perspective of the recruits, the other one pulls us out of it, and provides a second-order meta-perspective on the entire immersive setup, on the large technological apparatus that subtends and produces the game simulation, as well as of its users. Unwittingly, I believe, quoting Coleridge's famous statement on literature, one of the developers of VR war games, a man by the name of Floyd West, speaks about the aesthetics of a recent war game that was sold to the US military for $57 million. He says, What we're trying to do with infantry squad level training is suspension of disbelief. And the CryEngine 3 is the best video game technology on the market today. Leaving the viewer at once inside and outside the simulation, however, Fawuki's installation instead effects an attempt at a suspension of disbelief. With a double projection, the installation seeks to exchange and defunctionalize military immersive aesthetics. When seen from the outside, the images on the screen lose their transparency. They turn opaque and begin to appear as images. So instead of seeing images of the world, we begin to see a world of images. Fawuki thereby puts on display the aesthetic management that organizes the military apparatus, a management in which one's own death, as in the case of Watson, can be experienced multiple times and be transformed into an annoyed sigh that one has to wait until the mission can be replayed. So we might say that serious games, Fawuki's installation, embodies a kind of subtle form of critique, pulling the viewer out of the immersive image. His double projection seeks to make a separation to establish another point of view, a place to stand and look on the outside where the workings of the immersive military image may become evident. With his juxtaposition on two screens, his soft montage, he adopts a technique that has frequently been employed in recent artistic treatments of war. What I think distinguishes serious games is the juxtaposition on a first and second order observation. Fawuki seeks to disable the co-option of aesthetics by the military and its instrumentalized schematization of perception. If traditional serious games transform perception into recognition of inculcated schemas, the four videos that comprise serious games operate in reverse and seek to undo the schematism of recognition in order to reestablish a perceptive mode, dwelling on seemingly mundane images and activities, almost immobile soldiers staring at their screens or an instructor moving a mouse across a trackpad. The videos leave the viewer with a rather profound sense of disorientation. Often we have no clue what we're seeing, what we're supposed to see, what the point of a given sequence is, and nothing seems to be happening. So serious games in that sense has a form of an aesthetic inquiry into the workings of military images, an inquiry that does not seek to impose a fixed set of rules or principles, but that rather estranges the images that surround us, that undoes their self-evident character and tries to leave them suspended. So in that way, he tries to somehow reintroduce what the military aesthetic regime has done away with: novelty, contingency, uncertainty, and strangeness, and the sense that our mental visual schemas are schemas and nothing more. An antidote to the naturalization of schematized perception by the military, serious games reminds us that what matters most is often hidden by the very image that purports to display it. Now, Wittgenstein once remarked that the only difference between games and knowledge is their use, and he continued, if people on Mars wage war like we play chess, then the rules of chess would immediately take on serious meaning, and the general staff would become just as preoccupied with chess as it is now with the map. What the veteran of the trenches probably did not imagine was that this otherworldly warfare would eventually be realized in this simulated world of VR war games. What Fawuki suggests, however, is that in spite of the ever-increasing reality effects of modern war games, Wittgenstein's example remains imaginary. More than anything, it is the invention and highly ambiguous nature of such ludic illusions that Fawuki's inquiry, his double perspective on the military aesthetic regime, at once immersed and distanced, makes visible. At the same time, I do wonder whether Fawuki succeeds entirely in extricating himself from his material, whether by reproducing war technology, by curating military images with the lightest of touches, the installation does not rather affect the apotheosis of military aesthetics as art. The heavy reliance on the military images themselves makes it ambiguous whether Fawuki's attempt to reverse the military's co-option of aesthetics with a co-option of military images has a desired effect. Whether, in other words, the installation does not inadvertently allow for further expansion of the military field, such that not just the products of the culture industry, but also those of high art are eventually absorbed into the military realm. During the shooting of serious games, Fawuki and his crew were monitored, and at one point a PR press officer was flown in from the Pentagon to keep an eye on them. From the point of view of the military, the permission to film US US military training facilities and released the footage to the public must have been given in the belief that the beneficial effects would outweigh any adverse ones. However one views it, the very ambiguity of the installation itself reveals the degree to which recent developments in technology have succeeded in blurring the borders between warfare and aesthetics. Itself immersed in it, serious games offers a starting point, at least, for understanding the nature and effects of a very well-funded military aesthetic regime whose influence on future wars and lives I don't think will be waning. And here I am.
We have lots of time for questions.
I have a question regarding the Honnet quote you had. And I was wondering, in the German, is experience as regular, I mean, the German has Erlebnis or Erfahrung?
It's Erfahrung he's talking about.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
very interesting,
Yeah.
because that seems to be a step actually back from Benjamin, who has actually distinguished Erlebnis as exactly the way Honnet describes it here versus the Erfahrung, which allows us to integrate the experience and therefore gain the kind of reflexive mode or cognitive ability to integrate the onslaught of immobility of all these experiences and weaknesses. So I was just wondering, what are your thoughts there on Honnet, and to which extent actually a critique through Benjamin might support or might allow you to push the Faroki a little bit further, or to which extent the Faroki maybe falls into the same trap as Honnet, if I may so somewhat polemic.
Well, I think if we look at the kind of experiences being generated by the war games, sort of the distinction, the Benjaminian distinction between the Erlebnis and the Erfahrung might be more apt, in the sense that it seems to be a strange conflation of the two that is being sought by the military, where of course you want to inculcate certain patterns, operational patterns, that stay with people, or stay with the soldiers, but where these patterns are mostly non-conscious. So in that sense, it's not Erfahrung in the sense of a reflective knowledge, but it is nevertheless something that is supposed to...
Habituation?
Yes, the habituation. I mean, we heard that from the very first talk yesterday. Sort of the military knowledge paradigm really goes towards functionality. How can you make things work? So transforming cognitive knowledge into something that can be operative is the main goal. And I think sort of a mixture of the Benjaminian categories would actually be a better description of what is going on in the kind of experience being generated in these games.
I didn't expect to have a chance to strut my romantics credentials in this talk, but I can't but note that suspension of disbelief, which is Coleridge's phrase, has migrated its way into the Defense Department. This is extraordinary.
Well, not Defense Department, well, indirectly. This is a game developer.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Right. Anyway, but this question of the aesthetic, I was reminded of my other man, William Wordsworth, who in the Prelude describes standing beside a lake and watching a dead body pop up when it's finally inflated with enough gases to be floatable. And he says, that's right, and he says, it didn't bother me because I'd read all about all this in books. And therefore I was inoculated against being traumatized by this sight. And of course behind Wordsworth is Rousseau and his Lettre d'Alembert against the theatres, and behind Rousseau is Plato. And this is a long-standing suspicion of the aesthetic as dangerously inhibiting our capacity to experience anything. And yet at the same time an understanding that it's the aesthetic itself which forms the experiences that we have. And so I was wondering, you led us up to a very nice little paradox at the end, where you really were wondering whether, or you're making me wonder, I should say, whether the answer is not a very kind of rigid, puritanical position against all graven images whatsoever. If Faruqi himself cannot avoid implication in the aestheticization that he's attempting to educate us about, then we are in real trouble.
Yes. So certainly, thank you very much for the sort of the longer history of this. And I mean, I sort of leave it open at the end. He gave a lecture at some point where there was a precise critique of sort of the lightness with which he critiques.
Yes, that's right.
Because it can be so light that it is barely.
This is not critique.
Yes. And his response was, as long as I'm able to set off a debate about this, I will be more than happy. So in that sense, he, I think, views it as a kind of catalyst for possible reflections on how things are working and possible critiques. And he sort of enables that. And whether you pick it up or not is then left to the beholder.
So the question is, does he give a bit too much to the beholder?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm still, and I can only guess, but I'm still curious as to the rationale in the military for letting it happen, letting him in. They probably didn't know very much about who he was, is my guess, and the status that he has acquired recently.
Yeah.
This is reported in 2009, 2010. But at the same time, one does wonder what that rationale was.
And did they place his work, did they demand review before he was allowed to release it?
Yes.
They did?
Yeah.
Okay. Tells us a lot.
And just following that, how was that project funded? His project, Faruqi's project?
Oh, that I'm not sure of. Certainly not by the military.
Not by the military, but might it have been by the arts funding of some other state?
Could be. I simply don't have the answer to that.
I wonder, on the suspension of disbelief, since we have David here, isn't it in Coleridge the voluntary suspension of disbelief?
Willing
Yes,
Disbelief for a moment.
Yeah.
For a moment, which constitutes poetic faith. In other words, before reason comes flooding back.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. But of course, we live in a world where our great fear is that reason will not come flooding back in.
Yes.
Yeah. So the question of willing does seem an important question.
Yes.
Because this is for infantry squad level training, where you're going to disbelieve whether you want to or not, is the idea. That is, you may be disposed not to, but you will, eventually. We will make you, that is the purpose of our training.
We will make you believe.
We will make you suspend.
Okay. Yeah.
But not willingly. And, you're a recruit.
Pavlovian response.
Right.
Yeah. And this connects to a term familiar to all of us, but always, to me, a vexed one that you use both early and late, and that is co-opting. Co-opting could be rephrased as recruiting cooperation. It sounds, a little smarmily anodyne in the second form, but it sounds very sure of itself in the first form. And I wonder.
Yeah, no, point taken. I think when you read sort of their own discourse about what they do, there's much less reflection, which would, in that sense, suggest co-option, and more of using the tools that are available. When he talks about suspension of disbelief, and when many of these game developers talk about reality is our game and so on, the traditional, all the bells of literary theory start ringing, and I'm sure they did not do that for them. So perhaps you're right that co-option in that sense can be too willing too reflective a term to use on their behalf. On the other hand, looking at it from the outside, that nevertheless appears to be what is happening.
Anyone else? It's very late in the long afternoon. No.
Well, just again, informationally, I mean, this is I don't mean to say, what you're saying is so obvious, and I don't mean it's not smart. It's smart because it's obvious, and therefore, I'm just stunned that well, maybe we don't know. Does the latest VR wargame incarnation in fact factor in elements of boredom, surprise, distraction, ambient noise, something biting you on the toe, a scorpion, up your trouser leg? I mean, is there any attempt to break up this kind of totally simulacral world of training, which is in fact completely unsuitable for obviously battlefield conditions?
Right. So I cannot say what like the most recent things that they had, but I can. So in that sense, I can't really answer that question. But I can say that if you look at the history of the war games, this has been a persistent critique of them.
Yeah.
So one of the early critiques was by a guy called Horst, who's like totally forgotten today. He was a military theorist in the late 18th century. And he says, well, go to Potsdam, look at the military exercises there. What is being trained? Well, a completely pre-planned sequence of movements is being trained. But they're even being trained on the parade ground, which has nothing to do with the actual environment. So the epistemic order, the topographical order, all this has nothing to do with what war is actually like.
Panic training.
Panic training, yes. But I think sort of the trajectory then of all these games is precisely to begin to include all this. And the inclusion of dice is one example of it. The attempts that early war games move from sort of the two-dimensional chessboard into topographical maps,
Right.
sort of all generate this attempt to create, those kinds of simulations and those kinds of hazards and contingencies.
So it occurs to me then there's a way in which the move to the early stage of the VR game, as a kind that's portrayed here in Faruqi's work, is actually very much a regression from the training you have gotten from reading, say, Tolstoy or Stendhal, which in fact does deal with affect, does deal with surprise, does deal with narrative, does deal with all sorts of things that this entirely visual automated sequence is designed to basically suppress.
Well, I mean, these are not entirely automated. There's an instructor who is planning devices as they move.
I see.
So in that sense, it's not a prepackaged game.
Right.
So the contingency that can appear will be the contingency that the instructor can think of.
Yeah. But what completely left out is the world of affect. I mean, as the movie shows, these people sitting there yawning, scratching themselves.
Yeah.
But
then again, that might be actually one of the purposes of the game.
yes, it's a double-edged sword. Isn't it? I mean, you're preparing. It is like the panic training phenomenon. You're preparing for one kind of response, which is not to break ranks.
Right.
But at the same time, you're completely unpreparing for what will actually happen.
And there's two other moments. One, the military is using video games as recruiting devices.
Yeah.
Recruiting centers.
Yes.
Yeah.
But then it's interesting the way it's set up as a preparatory game and training and a post-battlefield trauma simulation.
Yeah.
But in between is the actual theater of drones, for example.
Yeah.
So the video screens in Nebraska are launching missiles. And so I wonder about the slippage between the moment of training, the lack of affect, and then the actual moment of actually operating the drone remotely. As a video game.
Yeah. I mean, I can't really add to that, but one of the games that the military released was called America's Army in 2003-4, I think, which immediately had over 9 million registered users and only more over time. which has, of course, been developed as a recruiting tool. I think what's interesting is that they were somehow behind the game. So they were, at the beginning of this process of moving into digitization, they were latching onto existing sort of civil games that were then being retooled for military purposes. I mean, some of the very, very primitive early games, they simply replaced monsters with terrorists, but it was the same game setup. But you're exactly right that there is that sort of further progression of this where there is no actual, or rather where the experience is sitting in front of the screen, which is the drone, which I suppose matches Wooki's sequence quite well because he precisely leaves that out. You have the before sequence, you have the after, but the actual combat is never there, which it was not in drone warfare.
In passing, you mentioned poetics alongside aesthetics,
Mm-hmm.
and I wonder if this is a separate term for you, and if so, if you could talk more about that, or if they're interchangeable. So that's one question. And the second question is there any possibility of failure built into the system? So, you know, if we were to imagine like an insurgency, right, taking up the same methods or trying to, you know, fight this system on its own terms, right? What would this insurgency do with or within the system? So that's a different way of, kind of a science fiction-y question, or who knows really, about the possibility of failure that might be introduced into it or that might be built into it unintentionally, or
And when you're saying built into the system, what is the system you're talking about?
a system of aesthetic habituation of the training through images that you're describing, its effectiveness, because the way you're describing it is according to how it's intended to work, right? So it appears very successful.
Okay.
So does it ever fail, and if so, how?
Yeah.
What's the
Well,
mechanism
to
for it?
start with that, there's been a fair amount of critique of the ways in which, not so much how it works to pre-plan, but how it works to treat soldiers who come back traumatized. And one of the critiques is that it actually, they're so powerful because much more realistic than any other form of repeating the trauma, that it actually reasserts the trauma rather than relieves it. So these types of treatment have a very high dropout rate. For the people who, so the critique was, this seemed to work. We're very happy with it, let's fund it even more. It turned out that it was successful for the people who went through it to the end. But if you looked at how many dropped out of it, it was actually not very successful because it was a huge dropout rate. And some of those people who dropped out reported being sort of re-traumatized by it. So that has been one of the major concerns that they have had. To the question of poetics and aesthetic, yes, I was sort of in my first book, I have been more concerned with the poetics. How do literary text actually construct certain epistemologies? How do you build in chance into literary text? How do you build it into a war game? So that's the nature of the actual object itself. What I found very interesting about this, though, was that they're so targeted towards an affective management, which comes into the entire tradition of aesthetics. And I think that is something, it's so difficult to examine these kinds of things if you're not in fields that do empirical studies. And that's why it's so much easier simply to look at the objects themselves. But at least you can look at the intentions, which are spelled out in the descriptions of what these objects are supposed to do with the affective management of the soldiers.
Take time for one more question.
Thanks. I'm not
No.
thanks for a great talk. And sort of two linked questions. The first has to do with the epistemic shift that you're tracking in terms of virtual this kind of virtual aesthetics, I would imagine there's a much longer history of flight simulation behind this, and I'm just curious, in an open-ended way, how that may have come up for you, and it ties in, of course, to the drone farm, kind of thing. But at the same time, because there was this sort of the novel or the VR ambivalence in some of the quotes that you put up, and I had this weird lunch one time with this guy named Lieutenant Colonel Jason Armagos, who was the spear point of the Shock and Awe campaign. He delivered the first bomb, right? And he talked about that flight, right, which was a 3-day flight, actually. He left from somewhere in St. Louis and was up in the air, circling the globe for 3 days, getting refueled in air and staying awake on Army-delivered methamphetamines and Starbucks double shots and things like that, right? But what was crazy about his account of it, and he's written about this in a very sort of Tim O'Brien, the things I carried while I was up there mode, is that he was reading classic, canonical world literature the entire time. So he was there reading the Iliad as he went over the Mediterranean, reading the Sun Also Rises as he went over Spain, starting to read poetry because in a very Poe-like way, he realized that he had to look at the controls every 3 minutes so he could read a poem in between, right? And then delivering the payload, right, on Baghdad. And this weird kind of sense that actually where literature fit into his aesthetic training was in the boredom mode of the drone operator sitting in Colorado waiting for something to happen, right? And so, obviously that's not part of the training, right? This is a kind of bizarre extension, but it made me think that the interplay between virtualization and other forms of aesthetic perception within particular forms of operationalized military conduct can be very complex and bizarre. So I don't know. It's an open-ended question about flight simulation and that axis, rather than the boots on the ground forms of stuff that you talked about today.
Right.
More in distance, maybe is really the.
Well, thanks for this. I'm not sure exactly where to take it. I mean, on the one hand, agreed, reading happens in the immense periods of boredom, which if you read any of the soldiers' accounts of who've gone there, many of them do this and do actually read. I don't think he's really exceptional in his reading list. But what I was trying to track was more the sort of officially sanctioned means of doing this. And so I know they still read Clausewitz in various military academies, but I'm actually not sure what their sort of literary requirements are. But if you go back in time, then there was a sense that this was, the text was actually the most advanced method for teaching the state of war, and thus simply had a different status. One of the, again, if you go back to someone like Clausewitz, he's interested in texts, but not just any text. He's interested in texts that reveal all the errors, the mistakes, the misunderstandings that take place during a given campaign. So of his 10 works on war, the treatise is really just 3, and the rest, most of the rest, are histories of various battles. And if you read these texts, these historical texts, then he's exceedingly concerned with who knew what and who did not know what when decisions were made and when decisions went wrong. So in that sense, back then there was for him a much greater sense of the value that you would find in historical or literary text that mattered less, but it mattered how they were written, it mattered what they showed. So it seemed to be, in that sense, a more officially sanctioned means of training people than today. But I completely acknowledge that reading happens when bored.
It's worth saying that the West Point claims that it provides the best training in history of any school in North America. Anyway, please thank panelists for something.